Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Good, because today we're heading back to the early 1980s, to Rome, Georgia. On the surface, it seemed like a peaceful, quiet community.
Small town, southern charm.
Exactly. But this town became the backdrop for a string of really shocking crimes. We're going to unpack the case of Judith Ann and Alvin Neelley, a young couple. A couple that, well, their actions left a trail of fear and violence and a whole lot of unanswered questions in their wake.
And I think what makes this case especially disturbing and definitely intriguing is Judith Ann's age. She was only 17 years old, and she became the youngest woman in U.S. history to be sentenced to death. But was she really the mastermind behind it all? Was she a manipulator? Or was she a victim? That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah. Big question. And that's what we're here to try to figure out. With cases like this, you always kind of wonder how things can get so bad, how it can escalate to such a horrific level. It's like watching one of those, slow motion train wrecks. You just can't look away. But in Rome, Georgia, this whole thing started with what seems like random acts of violence.
Hmm.
And they were all targeting the Rome Youth Development Center.
Yeah, and we're talking fire bombings, shootings, even threatening phone calls being made to the center. And one of the most chilling details, the voice on those calls, the voice making the threats, it was a woman. Just imagine trying to be an investigator back then, trying to piece together who could be behind it all.
It must have been terrifying for everyone in that town, too.
Sure.
Suddenly, this place they thought was safe, it's under attack. And then right into this chaotic scene drifts Judith Ann and Alvin Neelley, young couple just passing through.
And it's really important here to remember that Alvin already had a reputation, a history of violence, especially toward women. And he had this knack, this real talent for manipulation. Alvin was the kind of guy who could charm your pants off one minute and threaten, well, the next.
Sounds like a classic predator to me. And sadly, it seems he found a vulnerable target in Judith Ann. They were young, they were troubled, and they'd already been involved in some petty crimes together. But their actions, well, they took a dark turn, and fast. Things escalated, and they culminated in the unthinkable, the abduction and murder of 13-year-old Lisa Milliken.
This is where the case goes from disturbing to truly dark. Lisa was abducted from a shopping mall, held captive, and subjected to some truly unimaginable horrors. We're talking abuse, torture. She was even injected with cleaning products.
God, that's awful. It's hard to even fathom, the kind of pain and terror that poor girl must have endured. And for what? What could possibly drive someone to do something like that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And we have to really consider the roles that both Judith Ann and Alvin played in this whole tragedy. But it's important to know this wasn't their only crime either. Not long after Lisa disappeared, they tried to abduct another woman, Diane Bobo. Her car had broken down.
So they were, actively targeting women who seemed vulnerable.
It definitely seems that way. Thankfully, Diane refused to go with them. Sometimes your gut instinct just kicks in, right? Her intuition probably saved her life. And she later actually played a key role in identifying Judith Ann. Said that was the woman who'd approached her.
That's amazing. But tragically, their reign of terror didn't end there. They went on to abduct another woman, Janice Chapman, and they shot her boyfriend, John Hancock.
John's story is incredible. He was shot in the back, but he managed to play dead, stayed that way until they left. His survival and his testimony afterward. Those were key in connecting all of these, what had seemed like random acts of violence, and putting Judith Ann and Alvin at the center of it all.
Wait, so they shot him and just left him there to die. It's a miracle he made it. And the evidence in his case, that helped connect the dots.
Yeah, exactly. The bullets they used in the shootings, they matched the ones found at other crime scenes. And witnesses, including John, they were able to identify Judith Ann. Things were starting to come together, but the investigation was about to get much more complicated. As they dug deeper, the question of who was really calling the shots in this twisted partnership, it became harder and harder to answer.
So, yeah, it seemed like they were escalating. More and more violent, these two. Clearly a danger to anyone who crossed their paths. But the focus of the investigation, it shifted now, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It had to. Now the authorities had to try and figure out what was going on between Judith Ann and Alvin, really get into the dynamics of their relationship to figure out who was really in control.
So were they able to crack that?
Well, they got a break. A lucky one, really. Judith Ann, she got arrested in Tennessee for passing bad checks. So she lands in jail. And wouldn't you know it, Alvin starts showing up at the jail, all anxious and sweating, clearly worried about about what was happening to her.
Couldn't stay away, huh?
Yeah.
Even when he knew it was risky.
Yeah.
Just drawn right back to her.
Yep. That's what the authorities thought, too. His behavior, it raised a lot of red flags, made them realize he was connected to Judith Ann somehow, so they started digging into his past. And as soon as they connected him to the crimes back in Georgia, they moved in and arrested him as an accomplice.
Okay, so now they've got both of them. What happens then? Do they confess? Do they start cooperating with the investigation? Spill the beans?
Well, not quite. This is where things take another really interesting turn. Alvin, he immediately tries to pin the whole thing on Judith Ann. Classic manipulation, right? He tells the authorities that she was the mastermind, that she was the one who called him on a CB radio after she'd kidnapped Lisa, said she was violent and uncontrollable.
She's the monster, not me. Classic. But I'm guessing the investigators, they'd seen his type before, knew he was a good liar.
Oh, yeah, they were definitely skeptical. But they also had to think about Judith Ann's role, too.
Right.
And she gives them her own version of events, claims that she was the real victim in all of this.
Wow. So now they've got two very different stories.
Exactly. Judith Ann says she was trapped in an abusive relationship with Alvin, that he basically brainwashed her, forced her to participate in these awful acts. She's painting this picture of a young girl completely terrified of her abuser, manipulated into doing whatever he wanted.
Classic he said, she said. But there had to be some evidence to support or refute their claims, right?
There was. And this is where things get, well, really messy. There was evidence of abuse, witnesses who could speak to Alvin's violent temper, his controlling behavior. And Judith Ann, she had the scars and injuries to back up her claims of physical abuse. So there's that.
So on the one hand, you've got this known abuser, a history of violence, and he's pointing the finger at a young woman, a vulnerable one. But on the other hand, she's involved in these really horrific crimes.
And keep in mind, both of them are changing their stories, adding details, contradicting themselves. They're each trying to manipulate the situation to their advantage. It's a real tangled web of lies. And the investigators, they're trying to untangle it, thread by thread, to get to the truth, to figure out who's really responsible.
How do they even begin to do that? I mean, how do you separate fact from fiction when you're dealing with two people who are so clearly, just trying to save themselves?
That's the challenge, isn't it? They have to rely on physical evidence, witness testimony, expert analysis, try to put together a story that makes sense. And in this case, the physical evidence, it was really damning for both of them.
What kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, think about those cleaning products, the ones they found in Lisa Milliken's body. That points to a real level of cruelty, premeditation. That's hard to ignore. And then there was the fact that they found Alvin's semen on Lisa's body. When they confronted him about it, Alvin, he came up with this really far-fetched explanation. Disturbing, too. He was trying to shift the blame right back onto Judith Ann. Just shows you how far he was willing to go to save himself, even if it meant degrading and dehumanizing the victim even more.
God, that's sickening. So now we've got these two people clearly capable of violence and deception, each pointing the finger at the other. How did the justice system even, how do they even approach a case like this?
That's a question we're going to tackle in the next part of our deep dive. Because the trials of Judith Ann and Alvin Neelley, they didn't just determine their fate. They brought up some really profound questions about accountability, manipulation, the very nature of justice.
So much to unpack here. We left off with all these accusations flying around and these conflicting stories and this really disturbing evidence. I can't imagine what the victims' families must have been going through, waiting for justice to be served. So what happened when Judith Ann and Alvin, when they finally faced trial? What went down?
Well, Judith Ann's trial for Lisa Milliken's murder, that was a huge media event. Everyone was just glued to this story. Teenage girl accused of these horrific crimes. It was just captivating, really. And the prosecution, they laid out their case really carefully, presented all the evidence of Lisa's abduction and the torture and just the callous way her body had been, discarded. They argued that Judith Ann was a willing participant, said she was driven by rage and a desire to get revenge on society.
But her defense team, didn't they argue that she was a victim herself, that she'd been abused?
Right.
And that Alvin, he was the one calling the shots.
They did. They introduced this concept of battered woman syndrome. It was a relatively new legal defense back then. And they basically said that Judith Ann had been so abused by Alvin, psychologically and physically, that she was basically his puppet, incapable of acting on her own, or even thinking for herself.
So they were saying she wasn't responsible for her actions because of Alvin.
Yeah, pretty much. And this defense strategy, it really started a huge debate around the country. about how abuse plays a role in criminal behavior and what battered woman syndrome means, legally speaking. I mean, it's complicated, right? Could someone be both a victim and a perpetrator? Can someone be so manipulated that they're just, they're not accountable for what they do? These were tough questions, still are.
I bet the jury had a really hard time with this one. What did they decide?
Well, after weeks of testimony and, all that deliberation, the jury found Judith Ann guilty of murder. But they recommended life in prison without parole instead of the death penalty. It seemed like, like they understood just how awful the crime was, but also they kind of recognized that there might have been other things going on. Maybe abuse and manipulation played a role.
So they were trying to balance things out. Justice for Lisa, but also, some understanding of Judith Ann's situation.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. But then things take another crazy turn because the judge, he could override the jury's recommendation, and he did.
He sentenced her to death,
All right.
even though the jury said life in prison.
Yep. He believed that the crime was just, so bad and that Judith Ann was too dangerous. So at 17 years old, she became the youngest woman on death row in the whole country.
It's hard to believe. So what about Alvin? Did he face the same sentence?
Well, he had his own trial coming up
Yes.
for the murders of Lisa Milliken and Janice Chapman. And he saw what was happening. He knew Judith Ann was going to testify against him and that the evidence, well, it wasn't looking good for him. So he took a plea deal.
What did that involve?
He said he'd plead guilty to kidnapping and murder. And in exchange, he'd get life in prison, no parole. He was basically choosing to, avoid the death penalty, even though he tried to blame it all on Judith Ann at first.
Huh. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Trying to manipulate the system. And in the end, that might be what saved him.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer to this already crazy complicated case. And Judith Ann, she actually spent over 10 years on death row before they commuted her sentence to life in prison. But Alvin, he died in prison back in 2005, complications after surgery, I think it was.
So they both ended up, spending the rest of their lives behind bars. But this case, it leaves you with so many questions. Could someone really be both a victim and do things like that? Where's the line between accountability and being abused?
That's what makes these kinds of cases so fascinating and so disturbing. The Neelley case, it makes you think about some really uncomfortable truths about human nature. And about how complicated the justice system really is. Makes you think about manipulation and coercion and responsibility. And ultimately, I think it reminds us that there are no easy answers. Violence, it leaves a mark on individuals, on communities, and figuring out how to deal with it, well, that's something we're all still grappling with, really.
It's definitely a case that stays with you.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about justice and fairness and all of it.
Yep.
Well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll be back next week with another case. Another look into the dark side of human nature. See you then.